12 plantation estates across the Georgia coastal counties collapsed within a single decade, leaving their owners dead, bankrupt, or fleeing in disgrace. Local historians attributed it to coincidence, bad crops, disease, economic shifts. But the county records tell a different story, one buried in auction ledgers, property deeds, and court documents spanning from 1847 to 1857. Every single estate had purchased the same woman, a slave named Celeste, sold and resold 12 times, each transaction occurring just months before catastrophic ruin befell her new master. The survivors spoke of her beauty, her silence, and something else, something they couldn't quite name. Before we continue with the story of Celeste and the 12 estates that fell, if stories of forgotten American history intrigue you, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. We bring you the darkest, most mysterious tales buried in our nation's past. And comment below, tell us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience discovers these stories. Now, let's uncover what really happened to those 12 plantations. The auction houses of Savannah rarely saw such unusual circumstances, but the sale of Celeste in March 1847 set in motion events that would become whispered legend among Georgia's planter aristocracy. The coastal counties of Georgia in the late 1840s represented the pinnacle of American cotton wealth. From Chatham County south through Glynn and Camden, vast plantations stretched along the tidal rivers and marshlands, their white columned houses visible from steamboat routes. The estates competed not just in acreage or yield, but in displays of refinement, imported furnishings, educated children sent to Charleston or Philadelphia, and the quality of their enslaved workforce. Savannah's auction houses on Bryan Street conducted business with cold efficiency. The spring sales of 1847 brought buyers from across the coastal region, men whose names appeared on bank boards and shipping manifests. They came seeking field hands, skilled craftsmen, or domestic servants to staff their expanding operations. Celeste arrived at the Savannah Exchange on March 14, 1847, consigned by the estate of a deceased Charleston merchant. The paperwork listed her as 22 years old, trained in household service, with notations about her appearance that were unusual for such documents. The auctioneer, a man named Hiram Stokes, who had conducted thousands of sales, would later tell his wife that he'd never seen the buying room respond quite that way to any lot. She stood on the platform in a simple grey dress, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd. Men who attended auctions weekly, who prided themselves on shrewd evaluation of human chattel, found themselves unable to look away. Her features held that rare combination that transcended the usual categories of the trade. Her skin the color of café au lait, her face structured with an almost mathematical symmetry. Her bearing suggesting neither defiance nor submission, but rather a profound absence, as if she existed somewhere beyond the room itself. The bidding began at $400. Within minutes, it surpassed $2,000. Colonel Marcus Fenwick of Fenwick Hall, one of the largest rice plantations in Chatham County, secured her for $2,300, a sum that drew gasps even from men accustomed to such transactions. Fenwick Hall sat 15 miles south of Savannah, a 3-story mansion overlooking the Vernon River. Marcus Fenwick had inherited the property from his father and expanded it through advantageous cotton investments. At 48, he was a widower, his wife having died in childbirth 5 years prior, along with the infant. His household consisted of his 2 surviving children, a daughter, Virginia, aged 17, and a son, Marcus Jr., aged 15, along with approximately 200 enslaved workers and a rotating staff of overseers. The colonel's acquisition of Celeste raised eyebrows among his peers, not for the price. Men of his station often purchased expensive domestic servants, but for what it suggested about his household needs. A widower of good standing typically remarried within 2 years. Fenwick had not. The purchase of such a woman at such a price carried implications that genteel society preferred not to examine too closely. Celeste arrived at Fenwick Hall in late March as the azaleas began blooming along the circular drive. The head housekeeper, a free woman of color named Mrs. Delacroix, who had managed the household for 20 years, recorded Celeste's arrival in her meticulous household ledger. The entry noted the date, the purchase price, and a single observation. Girl arrived, placed in East Wing quarters. Very quiet. For the first month, Celeste's duties remained those of any domestic servant, assisting with the household laundry, serving at table, maintaining the colonel's private chambers. Virginia Fenwick, who kept a detailed diary, wrote of her, "Father's new girl is quite handsome but peculiar. She moves through the house like a ghost. I have never heard her speak more than necessary. The other servants avoid her." The colonel himself seemed satisfied with his purchase. He dined well, slept soundly, and attended to plantation business with his usual efficiency. His overseer, a Scotsman named Duncan McLaren, reported that the spring planting proceeded without incident. The rice fields flooded on schedule. The cotton acres showed promising early growth. On the evening of May 8, 1847, Colonel Fenwick dined alone in his study, a habit he'd developed since his wife's death. The meal consisted of roasted quail, spring greens from the kitchen garden, and a bottle of claret from his carefully maintained cellar. Celeste served him, as she had for the past 6 weeks, moving silently between the dining room and kitchen. Mrs. Delacroix, whose quarters were adjacent to the kitchen, later told investigators that nothing seemed unusual that night. The colonel dismissed the household staff at 9 o'clock, as was his custom. Celeste remained to clear the study. The screaming began at 10:30. Virginia Fenwick, reading in her bedroom on the second floor, heard her father's voice, not words, but sounds of agony that made her drop her book and rush into the hallway. Her brother emerged from his own room, his face pale. The sounds came from below, from the direction of the study. By the time they descended the stairs, the household had awakened. Mrs. Delacroix reached the study first, followed by McLaren, who had been reviewing ledgers in the overseer's cottage. They found the colonel on the floor, convulsing. His face had turned a dark purple, his hands clawing at his throat. Foam flecked his lips. The doctor arrived from Savannah at dawn. Too late. Colonel Fenwick died at 4:17 a.m., 7 hours after the onset of symptoms. The physician, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, examined the body and rendered his verdict. Apoplexy, possibly triggered by a tainted meal. Such deaths occurred with unfortunate regularity in the coastal low country, where the warm climate encouraged the growth of harmful elements in food. Celeste stood in the hallway during the doctor's examination, her expression unchanged. When questioned by McLaren, she explained in her soft, measured voice that the colonel had eaten the same meal as always, prepared by the cook as usual. She had only served it. She knew nothing of what followed. The investigation, such as it was, lasted 3 days. Dr. Pritchard found no obvious signs of poisoning, no smell of bitter almonds, no unusual discoloration beyond that caused by the death throes. The household staff testified that the evening had proceeded normally. The cook, an enslaved woman named Betty, who had prepared meals at Fenwick Hall for 30 years, wept while insisting that she'd done nothing different, nothing wrong. The colonel was buried in the family plot on May 12th. His will, examined by his attorney, revealed an estate worth approximately $80,000, a substantial sum, but not as substantial as it should have been. The rice crop had underperformed the previous season. Several investments in Savannah shipping had failed. The property carried debts that Marcus Jr., now the nominal head of household at 15, could not possibly manage. The estate went into receivership. The court appointed a trustee to manage the liquidation. Within 3 months, Fenwick Hall would be sold at auction, its contents dispersed, its enslaved workforce divided among creditors. On June 3, 1847, Celeste appeared on the auction block in Savannah once again. The second sale drew less attention than the first. Estate liquidations happened regularly, and slaves from bankrupt plantations often sold below market value. Yet several men who had attended the March auction noticed her return. One of them, a planter named Theodore Calhoun, who owned extensive holdings in Liberty County, placed the winning bid at $1,400. Calhoun's plantation, Liberty Oaks, specialized in Sea Island cotton, the long staple variety that commanded premium prices. Theodore Calhoun had built his fortune through careful management, and advantageous marriages. His first wife had died of fever. His second wife, Margaret, 20 years his junior, had given him a son but seemed perpetually dissatisfied with plantation life. Celeste's arrival at Liberty Oaks in mid-June coincided with the cotton's crucial growing period. She was assigned to household duties under the supervision of Margaret Calhoun, who maintained strict control over her domestic staff. The mistress of Liberty Oaks kept Celeste close, too close, according to the other servants. She insisted that Celeste attend her during her afternoon rest, help her dress, and brush her hair before bed. Theodore Calhoun, for his part, took little notice of the new acquisition. His concerns centered on the cotton fields and the growing tension with his overseers over labor practices. The 1847 season had brought unexpected challenges: a late spring frost, an infestation of bollworms, and persistent flooding in the lower fields. Margaret Calhoun's diary, discovered decades later in a Charleston archive, provides insight into those months. Her entries from July and August 1847 grew increasingly erratic. July 14th, Theodore spends every evening in his study. I am left alone with only Celeste for company. She does not speak unless spoken to, yet I find myself talking to her, telling her things I would not tell my own sister. August 2nd, had the most peculiar dream. Celeste stood at the foot of my bed, watching me. When I woke, she was there, exactly as I'd dreamed, holding my morning tea. She claimed she'd just entered. I don't believe her. August 19th. Theodore has taken ill. The doctor says it's the coastal fever, but I've never seen fever like this. He refuses to eat, barely drinks, says the food tastes wrong, like metal. Theodore Calhoun died on September 7th, 1847, after a 2-week illness characterized by progressive weakness, loss of appetite, and eventual organ failure. Dr. Pritchard, the same physician who had attended Colonel Fenwick, noted the similarities but attributed them to the endemic diseases of the coastal region. 2 prominent men dying within 4 months was unfortunate, but not unprecedented. The aftermath, however, proved more dramatic than the death itself. Margaret Calhoun, reviewing her husband's papers, discovered that Liberty Oaks was insolvent. Theodore had borrowed heavily against future cotton yields. The 1847 crop, damaged by weather and pests, would not cover his debts. The plantation faced foreclosure, but the financial revelation paled beside what the estate attorney discovered. Theodore Calhoun had recently altered his will. The changes, executed just 3 weeks before his death, redistributed significant assets away from Margaret and toward distant relatives and business associates. Margaret challenged the will in court, claiming her husband had not been of sound mind. The legal battle would drag on for months, draining what remained of the estate's value. Celeste was sold again on October 22, 1847, this time at a private sale arranged by the estate trustees. The buyer, James Hartwell of Bryan County, paid $900. 2 estates, 2 deaths, and 1 woman present at both. Coincidence? The courts thought so, but the pattern was only beginning to emerge. If you're as intrigued as we are, hit that like button and leave a comment with your theory. Could one woman truly be connected to such widespread ruin? Let's continue. The whispers began in Savannah's merchant exchanges and gentlemen's clubs that winter. Men who tracked such things, attorneys, auctioneers, factors who handled plantation accounts, noticed the pattern forming. Not explicitly, not in terms that would invite investigation, but in the way rumors spread through communities built on gossip and suspicion. That girl from the Fenwick sale, one might say over brandy, saw her at auction again, 3rd time this year. Heard Hartwell bought her. He won't get his money's worth, never does with those fancy house servants. Hartwell might not be as shrewd as he thinks. Remember Fenwick, remember Calhoun. James Hartwell's plantation, Hartwell Manor, represented old Georgia money, land grants dating to the colonial period, wealth accumulated over generations. James himself, at 61, embodied the paternalistic planter ideal. Methodist in faith, moderate in politics, known for relatively humane treatment of his workforce. He purchased Celeste not for himself, but for his wife, Catherine, who had been requesting additional household help. Catherine Hartwell, 58, managed her household with the precision of a military campaign. She interviewed Celeste personally before approving the purchase, asking questions about her previous placements, her skills, her temperament. Celeste's answers, soft and deferential, satisfied the mistress of Hartwell Manor. The winter of 1847-48 passed quietly. Celeste performed her duties without complaint. The Hartwells entertained guests for Christmas, hosting a ball that drew families from 3 counties. Witnesses later recalled seeing Celeste serving punch, moving through the crowded parlors, drawing admiring glances from several young gentlemen, but maintaining her characteristic silence. January brought the first hint of trouble. Catherine Hartwell, always healthy, developed persistent headaches, then fatigue, then nausea that no remedy could alleviate. Dr. Pritchard, summoned from Savannah, diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest and tonic. The symptoms worsened. By February, Catherine could barely leave her bed. She complained of numbness in her extremities, of a burning sensation in her stomach, of nightmares so vivid she woke screaming. James Hartwell, desperate, brought in specialists from Charleston and Augusta. They offered competing diagnoses: nervous disorder, latent consumption, a tumor of the stomach. Catherine Hartwell died on March 3, 1848, almost exactly 1 year after Celeste's first sale. The cause of death, as recorded by Dr. Pritchard: failure of the vital organs, consistent with advanced nervous disease. James Hartwell, grief-stricken, retreated from social obligations. His cotton factor in Savannah began noticing irregularities in the plantation accounts: missing shipments, unpaid debts, discrepancies between reported yields and actual sales. An audit revealed systematic embezzlement by Hartwell's overseer, who had been siphoning funds for years. The overseer fled to Texas before he could be arrested. The plantation, already struggling with debt from Catherine's medical expenses, faced ruin. James Hartwell suffered what his physician termed a crisis of melancholy. On April 10, 1848, he was found in his study, having consumed a fatal dose of laudanum. The estate sale occurred in May. Celeste appeared on the block for the 4th time. By the summer of 1848, the pattern had become impossible to ignore, at least for those paying attention. 3 estates ruined, 3 owners dead, 1 woman sold and resold at each location. Yet the legal system, built on precedent and evidence, found no grounds for investigation. Slaves changed hands constantly. Plantations failed regularly. Death was commonplace in the disease-prone coastal lowlands. But in the informal networks where planters' wives exchanged information, in letters, at church socials, during calls, Celeste's name began appearing with increasing frequency. Not in accusatory terms, which would have invited scandal and legal complications, but in cautious warnings disguised as practical advice. "I heard the Trentham place bought that girl from the Hartwell estate. Such a shame about James and Catherine. The coastal fever is particularly bad this year. 4 times sold in 15 months. That's unusual, isn't it? Though I suppose there's always an explanation. My husband saw her at the Bryan Street auction house again. Beautiful, certainly, but there's something about the eyes. Empty, they say, like looking into a well." The 4th buyer, William Trentham of McIntosh County, dismissed such talk as superstitious nonsense. A Yale-educated man who considered himself above provincial prejudices, he purchased Celeste in June 1848 for $700. A bargain, he thought, for such a well-trained servant. His wife had recently died in childbirth, leaving him with 3 young children who needed supervision. Celeste assumed the role of nursemaid at the Trentham estate. The children, aged 7, 5, and 3, initially feared her silence, but she proved patient and capable. She fed them, dressed them, told them stories in her soft, barely audible voice. The oldest child, William Jr., would later recall that her stories were always about patience, animals who waited for the right moment, seeds that lay dormant through winter, rivers that slowly carved through stone. William Trentham Sr. began experiencing financial difficulties within 2 months of Celeste's arrival. His cotton factor in Savannah discovered irregularities in the accounts. Shipments went missing. Buyers claimed they never received contracted deliveries. Trentham's overseer insisted the cotton had been shipped properly, but the documentation told a different story. In October 1848, a fire swept through Trentham's main cotton barn, destroying 3/4 of the year's crop. The local sheriff investigated and found evidence suggesting arson, rags soaked in lamp oil, hidden beneath loose floorboards. But the overseer had fled the night of the fire, and no other suspects emerged. Trentham, facing bankruptcy, began drinking heavily. His behavior became erratic. He accused his slaves of conspiracy, his factor of theft, his late wife's family of plotting against him. On Christmas Eve, 1848, he rode his horse into the swamps south of his plantation and did not return. They found his body 3 days later, drowned in 4 feet of water, his horse grazing peacefully nearby. The estate sale in February 1849 included Celeste as lot number 37. She sold for $500 to a consortium of 3 planters who jointly owned a rice operation in Camden County. The consortium arrangement represented an unusual business structure. 3 men, Thomas Beaumont, Richard Howell, and Samuel Yates, who had pooled resources to purchase a large rice plantation along the Satilla River. They shared ownership, divided profits, and made decisions collectively. Their joint purchase of Celeste was intended to staff the main plantation house, which all 3 families visited regularly. The arrangement proved disastrous from the start. Beaumont and Howell began quarreling over management decisions within weeks of Celeste's arrival. Yates, caught between them, grew increasingly withdrawn. By summer 1849, the partnership had deteriorated into bitter legal disputes. Each man accused the others of mismanagement, theft, or sabotage. The rice crop failed that season, flooded by unusual summer rains that breached the carefully maintained dikes. An investigation suggested the dikes had been deliberately damaged, but no evidence pointed to any specific culprit. The 3 partners blamed each other. In September 1849, Thomas Beaumont was killed when his carriage overturned on the road between Savannah and his plantation. The accident occurred in broad daylight on a well-maintained road. The driver, who survived, claimed the horses had suddenly spooked, though nothing visible had frightened them. Richard Howell died of fever 3 weeks later. Samuel Yates, the surviving partner, immediately petitioned the court to dissolve the consortium. He sold his share of the plantation at a loss and moved his family to Augusta, telling friends he wanted nothing more to do with coastal rice farming. The plantation went to auction in November 1849. Celeste was sold separately, her price now dropped to $300. Her 6th buyer, Edmund Grayson of Glynn County, was a bachelor who maintained a small but profitable Sea Island cotton operation. 6 plantations, 6 owners destroyed, and we're only halfway through this nightmare. Just when we thought we'd seen the worst, the horror in Georgia's coastal counties intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Edmund Grayson considered himself too rational for superstition. When his factor in Savannah mentioned the rumors surrounding Celeste, Grayson laughed them off as the fevered imagination of bored plantation wives. He bought her in December 1849, specifically to prove that a well-run operation had nothing to fear from gossip. His confidence lasted exactly 4 months. The winter of 1849-50 began normally at Grayson's plantation, a modest 300-acre operation called Palmetto Grove. Grayson lived alone, except for his enslaved workforce of 43 people and an overseer named Jacob Turner. He prided himself on efficiency, keeping meticulous records of every expense and harvest yield. Celeste's duties at Palmetto Grove differed from her previous placements. With no wife or children to attend, she served primarily as Grayson's personal servant, maintaining his chambers, serving his meals, managing the household supplies. Turner, the overseer, noted in his weekly reports that she performed her tasks adequately, but added an unusual observation. The slaves avoid her. When she enters the quarters, conversation stops. Grayson dismissed this as meaningless. Field slaves often resented house servants, viewing them as privileged collaborators. But Turner's reports grew more concerning through January and February. Tools went missing from the workshops. A storage barn's lock was found broken, though nothing seemed stolen. 3 slaves attempted to run away, unusual for Palmetto Grove, which had never experienced escape attempts in Grayson's 10 years of ownership. In March 1850, Grayson began experiencing strange symptoms. Not illness, exactly, but a growing sense of unease. He had difficulty sleeping. When he did sleep, nightmares woke him, dreams of drowning, of suffocation, of being buried alive. He started double-checking locks, convinced someone was entering his room at night. His appetite diminished. Food tasted wrong to him, though Turner and the cook insisted nothing had changed in the kitchen. By April, Grayson's paranoia had become obvious to everyone on the plantation. He accused Turner of stealing. He claimed the slaves were plotting rebellion. He began carrying a loaded pistol at all times, even inside the house. His letters to his factor in Savannah grew increasingly erratic, filled with tangential observations and sudden accusations. On April 19, 1850, Jacob Turner was found dead in his cottage, killed by a single gunshot wound. Grayson insisted he had shot the overseer in self-defense, claiming Turner had attacked him. The local sheriff, investigating the scene, found no evidence of a struggle. Turner's pistol remained holstered. The fatal shot had struck him from behind. The sheriff arrested Grayson and transported him to the county jail. At trial, Grayson's attorney argued temporary insanity brought on by isolation and stress. Witnesses testified to his declining mental state over the previous weeks. The prosecutor, however, presented evidence suggesting premeditated murder. Grayson's increasingly hostile letters about Turner, his accusations of theft that no audit supported, his claims of conspiracy that no evidence corroborated. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before finding Grayson guilty of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 15 years at the state prison in Milledgeville. His property, including his enslaved workforce, was sold to cover legal expenses and compensation to Turner's widow. Celeste appeared at auction in Savannah on June 12, 1850, selling for $200 to a man named Henry Drayton. The price had dropped significantly, from $2,300 3 years earlier to a fraction of that amount. The auction house records from June 1850 reveal why. Hiram Stokes, the auctioneer who had conducted Celeste's first sale, included an unusual notation beside her listing, not explicitly warning away buyers, which would have been illegal, but providing a detailed purchase history that any astute observer would find troubling. Henry Drayton either didn't notice or didn't care. A recent widower desperate for household help, he bought Celeste to care for his elderly mother and manage his home in Liberty County. Drayton's plantation, called River Bend, sat along a particularly isolated stretch of the Midway River. The main house, a 2-story structure dating to the 1790s, had fallen into disrepair since the death of Drayton's wife 2 years earlier. His mother, Adelaide, 73 and increasingly frail, lived in an upstairs bedroom, rarely descending to the main floor. Celeste assumed care of Adelaide Drayton in late June 1850. The arrangement seemed to suit everyone. The old woman appreciated having a competent nurse, Henry could focus on plantation business, and Celeste performed her duties with her customary efficiency. Then Adelaide began talking. The other servants, questioned later, reported that Mrs. Adelaide had always been talkative, prone to rambling stories about the old days. But in July and August, her talk took on a different quality. She began confiding in Celeste, telling her family's secrets, debts hidden from creditors, infidelities covered up, a child born out of wedlock and given away, property stolen from a deceased neighbor. Henry Drayton noticed his mother's loose tongue and tried to limit Celeste's time with her. But Adelaide had grown dependent on her nurse and refused to allow anyone else to attend her. The old woman's revelations continued, growing more detailed and damaging. She spoke of her late husband's involvement in smuggling operations during the 1820s. She mentioned her son's forged shipping documents. She described in detail how the Drayton family had acquired their first landholdings through fraudulent claims that displaced a Creek family. In September, Adelaide Drayton died peacefully in her sleep, a natural death for a woman of 73. But at the funeral, attended by 3 neighboring families, rumors of her deathbed confessions had already spread. By October, Henry Drayton found himself facing questions from the county clerk about property titles. A revenue agent from Savannah began investigating his shipping records. The scrutiny intensified through November. Drayton's cotton factor, alarmed by the growing evidence of fraud, severed their business relationship. Banks refused credit. buyers backed out of contracts. On December 8, 1850, the county sheriff arrived at Riverbend with a warrant for Drayton's arrest on charges of customs fraud and property theft. Drayton fled before the arrest could be executed. His plantation was seized by the county to cover fines and restitution. The property sold at auction in January 1851. Celeste, lot 42 in the estate sale, brought $150 from her eighth buyer. By 1851, the coastal planter community had fractured into two camps regarding Celeste. The first group, comprising older, more traditional families, viewed the entire matter as coincidental tragedy, the natural result of poor management, bad luck, and the general economic volatility of plantation agriculture. The second group, more numerous but less powerful, believed something darker was at work. The division played out in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs across Savannah. At the Planters' Bank on Bay Street, men who had once conducted business with easy familiarity now eyed each other with suspicion. Those who had purchased slaves from estates where Celeste had resided found themselves subjected to subtle social exclusion. Their wives received fewer invitations. Their daughters were passed over for advantageous matches. No one stated the reasoning explicitly, but the implication was clear. Association with the cursed sales carried a taint. The controversy reached its peak in March 1851, when the Savannah Agricultural Society held its annual meeting. The society, comprising the region's most prominent planters, had gathered to discuss crop rotation techniques and new cotton varieties. But during the social hour following the formal presentations, the conversation inevitably turned to Celeste. Colonel Harrison Merriweather, a rice planter whose family had held land in South Carolina since 1690, stood before the assembled men and delivered what amounted to a public dismissal of the rumors. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the meeting hall, "we are educated men, not superstitious field hands. We deal in facts, in ledgers, in the rational management of agricultural enterprises. The notion that a single slave woman could orchestrate the collapse of multiple plantations is absurd on its face. These estates failed due to poor oversight, excessive debt, and the inherent risks of our business. Nothing more." His speech drew approving nods from the older members, but a younger planter named William Sutherland stood to respond. Sutherland, whose neighbor had been the late David Crawford, spoke with barely contained frustration. "Colonel Merriweather, with respect, you speak from the safety of South Carolina, where this woman has never set foot. Those of us in the Georgia coastal counties have watched a pattern unfold that defies reasonable explanation. 7 estates in 4 years, sir. 7. The mathematical probability of such clustering is infinitesimal." The room erupted in competing voices. Men shouted across tables, their usual decorum abandoned. The society's president, forced to restore order by threatening to adjourn the meeting, managed to quiet the assembly. But the damage to the community's cohesion was done. Planters who had cooperated for decades on irrigation projects and political advocacy now viewed each other with mistrust. The problem was evidentiary. No investigation had uncovered proof of wrongdoing. Dr. Pritchard, who had attended several of the deceased, found no evidence of poisoning or violence beyond what might occur naturally. He had kept careful records of each case, and when pressed by colleagues to review them collectively, he maintained his professional judgment. Coastal fever, apoplexy, accidents, suicide, these are common enough individually. That they cluster around particular properties might suggest environmental factors, poor water quality, shared commercial relationships that expose multiple parties to the same fraudulent practices. But to suggest deliberate action by an enslaved woman requires evidence I simply do not possess. The sheriffs who investigated various incidents found no clear evidence pointing to Celeste. Several had questioned her directly over the years. Each reported the same experience. A quiet, deferential woman who answered questions with soft-spoken clarity, who showed neither guilt nor defiance, who seemed almost absent even while physically present. One sheriff, a man named Thomas Crane, who had investigated Edmund Grayson's shooting of his overseer, told colleagues, "I've questioned hardened criminals, con artists, and murderers. I know evasion when I see it. This woman doesn't evade, she simply provides no purchase for interrogation. It's like trying to grip smoke. Slaves had no legal standing to testify against whites, and in any case, what testimony could they offer? Several overseers and drivers, when questioned informally by their employers, reported that other slaves avoided Celeste. But pressed for specifics, they could provide little. She didn't threaten. She didn't organize. She didn't even speak more than necessary. She simply existed in a way that made others uncomfortable. One driver, a man named Tobias, who had supervised Celeste briefly at the Trentham estate, provided the most detailed observation when questioned by a curious neighbor. She works like any field hand when assigned, does what she's told, but in the quarters at night, people stop talking when she comes near. Not because she demands it, because something in them goes quiet. It's like when a hawk flies over and all the small birds go still. They don't know why they're quiet. They just are. The attorneys and factors who handled the estate sales noted the pattern but could do nothing. Property law required that slaves be sold as assets, and without criminal conviction, no legal mechanism existed to remove Celeste from the market. Several auctioneers began including unofficial warnings with her sale documents, but these remained vague. Extensive purchase history available upon request, or buyer should review full provenance. Hiram Stokes, the auctioneer who had conducted her first sale, found himself in an ethical dilemma. By 1851, he had handled 5 of Celeste's 12 sales. His professional reputation demanded discretion. Revealing negative information about merchandise could expose him to legal liability from sellers. But his conscience troubled him, particularly after the death of John Mitchell, whose widow had specifically asked Stokes if there were any concerns about the purchase. In May 1851, Stokes visited his minister, Reverend Daniel Whitfield of the Independent Presbyterian Church, seeking counsel. The conversation, recorded in Whitfield's pastoral diary, reveals Stokes's moral struggle. Mr. Stokes arrived at my study in evident distress. He explained the situation. A slave woman sold repeatedly, always followed by misfortune to her purchaser. He asked whether he had a Christian duty to warn potential buyers, even if doing so violated commercial confidence and possibly law. I advised him that the law and his professional obligations were clear, but that God's law supersedes man's when innocent lives are at stake. Yet I cautioned him. Without proof of actual wrongdoing, he risked committing the sin of bearing false witness. We prayed together, seeking divine guidance. Stokes never resolved the dilemma to his satisfaction. He continued conducting sales, his conscience increasingly burdened until his retirement in 1854. His final journal entry regarding Celeste, written after her 12th sale, contained a single sentence: "May God forgive me for what I failed to prevent." The 8th through 11th buyers each lasted between 2 and 7 months. The details varied, but the outcomes remained consistent, and with each failure, more details emerged about the mechanisms of collapse. John Mitchell of Bryan County, who purchased Celeste in January 1851, ran what contemporaries described as a tight operation, moderate debt, good yields, strong relationships with his factor. His sudden illness in March seemed to come from nowhere. The symptoms began with what he described to his wife as a metallic taste in his mouth. Within days, he couldn't keep food down. His skin took on a grayish pallor. Dr. Pritchard, summoned to the bedside, observed symptoms consistent with acute mineral poisoning, but could find no source. Mitchell's factor, reviewing the plantation accounts during the medical crisis, discovered something Mitchell himself had apparently not known. His overseer had been conducting unauthorized business on the side, using Mitchell's slaves to clear land for neighboring properties, pocketing the fees and doctoring the time records to hide the theft. The scheme had been operating for at least 2 years. When confronted, the overseer fled, taking with him approximately $3,000 in embezzled funds. Mitchell died on March 28, 1851. The funeral drew a large crowd. He had been well liked in the community, but the financial autopsy of his estate revealed systematic theft that should have been detected by any attentive owner. His widow, forced to sell the plantation to satisfy debts, made a bitter observation to her sister in a letter. John was not a fool, yet he was made foolish. He stopped checking the ledgers, stopped watching the overseers, stopped maintaining the vigilance that had built his fortune. It was as if something had distracted him, pulled his attention elsewhere. David Crawford of Camden County, buyer number 9, provided perhaps the clearest example of the pattern. A meticulous record keeper who maintained daily journals of plantation operations, Crawford's entries from spring and summer 1851 show a man gradually losing his grip on business fundamentals. His journal from April, shortly after purchasing Celeste, contains typical entries, detailed notes on planting schedules, weather observations, records of slave health, financial calculations. By May, the entries grow less focused, more philosophical. He writes at length about the nature of property, the moral complications of slavery, the question of whether souls can be owned, even if bodies can be. In June, he stops recording plantation business entirely. His entries become personal reflections, almost stream-of-consciousness observations. One entry from late June reads, "She watches me at dinner. Not obviously, she serves the meal, clears the plates, does exactly as instructed. But there's a quality to her presence that makes me aware of myself, of my actions, of what I represent. It's like being observed by history itself. I find myself thinking about things I've pushed aside, the families I've separated through sales, the children I've traded away from their mothers, the bodies I've worked until they broke. These are simply the operations of agriculture, I tell myself. But under her gaze, they become something else." By July, Crawford had stopped maintaining his daily oversight. His overseer reported to a concerned neighbor that Crawford spent hours in his study, writing in his journals, or simply staring into space. The barn fire that destroyed his cotton crop occurred on July 23rd. Whether through accident, sabotage, or simple neglect of proper fire precautions remained unclear. Crawford made no attempt to rebuild. He sold the property at a loss and moved to Charleston, where he lived in boarding houses, supported by family charity, until his death in 1856. Robert Bennington of McIntosh County, a rice planter who bought her in October 1851, maintained his composure longer than most. A former military officer who had served in the Seminole Wars, Bennington prided himself on discipline and emotional control. He assigned Celeste to field work, kept her under constant supervision, and showed no obvious signs of the psychological deterioration that had affected Crawford. Yet his own letters reveal subtle changes. In November 1851, he wrote to a cousin in Virginia, "The coastal climate affects men's minds, I think. The constant humidity, the fever seasons, the isolation of plantation life, these things wear on one's rationality. I find myself entertaining thoughts I would have dismissed as nonsense during my military service. Not supernatural thoughts precisely, but rather an acute awareness of how precarious our entire system is, how dependent on the cooperation of those we've enslaved, how vulnerable we are to their resentment." In December, Bennington was found drowned in his own rice field. The water was only 3 feet deep. An experienced planter and former soldier, he should have easily saved himself. The inquest ruled accidental death, suggesting he had slipped on the muddy bank, struck his head, and fallen unconscious into the water. But the overseer who found the body noted something odd. Bennington's boots were unlaced, his coat unbuttoned, as if he had been preparing to enter the water deliberately. Charles Hartford of Glynn County, the 11th owner who purchased Celeste in January 1852, lasted 6 months before his complete mental collapse. Hartford's descent was witnessed by his brother, Marcus, who lived on an adjacent property and visited frequently. Marcus Hartford later described the progression in a letter to the family physician. "Charles was always high-strung, but perfectly rational when he bought the woman. Within a month I noticed changes. Difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, growing paranoia. He began accusing his slaves of plotting against him, though no evidence supported this. He claimed his overseer was stealing, though the books showed no irregularities. By April, he was barely functional. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing, occasionally muttering about debts and judgment. In May, he became convinced that his late wife, who had died in childbirth 3 years prior, was speaking to him, demanding accounting for his sins. The final break came in June. I found him in his cotton fields naked, screaming at the sky about blood and profit and eternal reckoning. The physician diagnosed acute mania. We had no choice but to commit him. Charles Hartford remained institutionalized at the state asylum in Milledgeville until his death in 1867. The asylum records, reviewed decades later by historians studying antebellum mental illness, show that he never fully recovered lucidity. His recurring delusion, as documented by his physicians, centered on the belief that he was being judged by those he had enslaved, that their silent witness was slowly driving him mad. With each sale, Celeste's price dropped. By July 1852, when she appeared on the block for the 12th time, her value had fallen to $100, a price suggesting damaged goods or a known problem worker, neither of which her appearance or behavior indicated. The decline in value itself told a story. The market was pricing in risk that couldn't be legally acknowledged or formally documented. The 12th buyer, Alexander Vaughn, knew exactly what he was purchasing. Vaughn represented a different breed of planter, younger, more cynical, willing to risk reputation for potential gain. At 32, he belonged to the generation that had grown up in the slave economy, but had also been exposed to Northern education and broader intellectual currents. He had spent 2 years at Princeton before returning to Georgia to claim his inheritance. That education had given him both skepticism towards supernatural explanations and confidence in his ability to rationally analyze complex situations. He attended the July auction specifically to buy Celeste, having studied the pattern of her sales with the cold calculation of a man who believed he could succeed where others had failed. In the week prior to the auction, he had visited the offices of attorneys who had handled several of the estate liquidations, reviewed court records of the deaths and bankruptcies, and interviewed 2 of the widows left behind by previous owners. His notes from these investigations, preserved in his papers, show systematic analysis. Fenwick, aged 48 widower, known to be lonely, purchased C at inflated price, suggesting emotional rather than economic motive. Death by apparent poisoning, but no evidence found. Estate review revealed long-term financial mismanagement predating C's arrival. Conclusion: existing problems, possibly exacerbated but not caused by C. Calhoun. Financially overextended, marriage troubled. Purchased C during period of stress. Death by wasting illness. Posthumous discovery of will changes and hidden debts. Wife's diary suggests she confided excessively in C. Conclusion: domestic dysfunction and financial chaos already present. Hartwell, elderly, grief-stricken widower. Wife's death by illness, then financial embezzlement by overseer discovered. Husband suicide by laudanum. Pattern suggests emotional instability and poor oversight. C. Present but unclear causal connection. Common factors across all cases: emotional vulnerability, financial irregularity, poor oversight, social isolation. Hypothesis: C may serve as catalyst rather than cause. Buyers predisposed to failure select attractive slave as compensation for other life problems. Presence of such purchase signals, poor judgment to community, invites scrutiny and exploitation. C herself may simply be witness to inevitable collapse. His reasoning, as he explained to his factor in Savannah, was simple. 12 estates failed. But was it the woman, or was it the type of men who bought her? Every single buyer was either old, financially insecure, or emotionally compromised. I am none of those things. I'm 32, debt-free, and I have no illusions about the nature of property. If there's a problem, I'll identify and eliminate it. If not, I've acquired an asset at 1/20th her original value. Vaughn's Plantation, Blackwater Point, occupied 2,000 acres of prime cotton land in Liberty County. He had inherited the property at age 25 and had spent 7 years modernizing operations, implementing new cultivation methods he'd learned about in agricultural journals, and maintaining strict financial discipline. His enslaved workforce numbered over 300. His overseer, a former military officer named Patrick Sullivan, ran the operation with military precision, regular inspections, detailed record-keeping, swift punishment for infractions, and careful monitoring of all plantation operations. The two men had served together briefly during the Mexican War, where Vaughn had been a lieutenant and Sullivan a sergeant. Their relationship combined friendship with clear hierarchical understanding. Sullivan respected Vaughn's intelligence and deferred to his judgment, but he also felt free to offer frank counsel when he believed his employer was making mistakes. When Vaughn announced his intention to purchase Celeste, Sullivan objected. "Sir, I don't care about curse stories or superstition, but I do care about patterns. This woman is connected to 12 business failures. Maybe it's coincidence, maybe not. Either way, buying her marks you as either foolish or arrogant in the eyes of the commercial community. Your reputation is your credit. Don't risk it for a $100 field hand." Vaughn had considered the advice and rejected it. "Patrick, my reputation is built on rational decision-making and successful operations. I'll demonstrate both by succeeding where others failed. Let them whisper. Actions speak louder than gossip." Celeste arrived at Blackwater Point on July the 22nd, 1852. Vaughn assigned her to work in the fields, a deliberate choice. He wanted her visible, supervised, unable to work in the shadows of domestic service where previous disasters had unfolded. Sullivan placed her in a work gang of 40 slaves under the direct oversight of a driver named Isaac, a man known for his vigilance and unwavering loyalty to plantation management. Isaac received specific instructions. Celeste was never to be alone. She was to be accompanied to and from the fields. Any deviation from assigned tasks was to be reported immediately. Any conversation with other slaves was to be noted. Isaac, who had served as driver for 8 years and had never failed in his duties, accepted the assignment without question. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Celeste picked cotton alongside the other workers. She worked from dawn to dusk under Isaac's watch, maintained adequate, though not exceptional productivity, returned to the quarters at night, and spoke to no one beyond necessary responses to direct questions. She ate her rations, slept in her assigned cabin, and showed no signs of unusual behavior. Vaughn, watching from the main house or riding through the fields on his daily inspections, began to believe his assessment had been correct. The previous owners had been weak or foolish, and the pattern of disasters had been nothing more than statistical clustering combined with poor management. He noted in his journal, 3 weeks with no incident. C works adequately. Sullivan's precautions seem excessive but cost little to maintain. Beginning to believe the entire matter was manufactured by superstitious minds unable to accept responsibility for their own failures. Then, on the night of August 11th, Isaac reported an incident that would prove to be the beginning of Vaughn's education. Isaac had been conducting his usual evening rounds of the quarters, a practice Sullivan required of all drivers, ensuring slaves were accounted for and no unauthorized movement occurred after dark. At approximately 9 o'clock, he had found Celeste standing near the cotton barn, approximately 50 yards from her assigned cabin. She wasn't inside the barn, wasn't doing anything obviously wrong, but simply standing there in the moonlight, staring at the building. When Isaac questioned her, she had turned to face him with that characteristic blank expression and said only, "Couldn't sleep, needed air." Then she had walked back to the quarters without further explanation. Isaac, following Sullivan's instructions to report any irregularities, documented the incident in writing. Unusual for an overseer or driver, but Vaughn had implemented systematic record-keeping across all plantation operations. Sullivan brought the report to Vaughn the next morning. The two men discussed it over breakfast on the main house veranda, where they could speak privately. "It might be nothing," Sullivan said, spreading butter on a biscuit. "But you wanted documentation of everything. She was out of bounds after dark with no legitimate explanation." Vaughn considered the report. "Has Isaac observed her speaking with other slaves? Forming relationships that might facilitate coordinated action?" "No, sir. If anything, she's isolated. The other slaves avoid her. Isaac says conversation stops when she approaches the cook fire in the evenings. They're not hostile to her, just distant. Fear? Isaac doesn't think so. He says it's more like discomfort, like how people move away from someone who's ill not because they might catch the illness, but because being near it reminds them of their own mortality." Vaughn made a note in his daily journal, then decided on increased supervision. Celeste was to be accompanied at all times, even within the quarters. Any deviation from assigned work areas was to be reported immediately. Sullivan implemented the new protocols with his characteristic efficiency, briefing Isaac and the other drivers on the updated requirements. For a week, the enhanced oversight produced no new incidents. Then, on August 19th, a field slave named Daniel collapsed while working. The plantation physician, a local doctor named Reynolds, who maintained a contract to provide medical care for Blackwater Point's enslaved population, examined Daniel and found him suffering from severe abdominal cramping, vomiting, and a distinctive blue-black line along his gums, symptoms consistent with acute lead poisoning. Lead poisoning was not unheard of on plantations. It could occur from contaminated water pipes, improperly glazed pottery, or paint containing lead compounds. But Reynolds's examination raised questions. Daniel's symptoms were acute, suggesting recent exposure to a significant dose rather than gradual accumulation. Moreover, 3 other slaves from the same work gang developed milder versions of the same symptoms over the following week. Sullivan conducted an immediate investigation of potential exposure sources. The water supply came from a well that had been tested and found clean. The cooking pots were iron and copper, not lead-lined. The slaves' cabins contained no paint. The work gang had not been assigned any tasks that would involve lead exposure. No painting, no plumbing work, no handling of glazed pottery or lead-based compounds. The investigation turned up one curious finding. Daniel and the 3 other affected slaves all ate from a communal pot that received food from the plantation kitchen. The cook, an enslaved woman named Martha who had prepared meals at Blackwater Point for 15 years, insisted she had changed nothing in her methods. The food came from the same suppliers, was stored in the same larder, was prepared in the same pots she had always used. Reynolds, conducting his own investigation at Vaughan's request, found traces of white lead, a pigment compound, in the ash residue beneath the cooking pot. Not enough to determine the source, but enough to explain the poisoning. Someone had introduced lead into the food preparation, either by contaminating the raw ingredients or by adding it during cooking. Martha, interrogated by Sullivan, wept and swore she had done nothing wrong. She had prepared thousands of meals without incident. She had no access to lead compounds. She had no motive to poison workers whose labor she depended on for her own survival. Sullivan, who had known Martha for years, believed her. The kitchen was secured, new procedures implemented for food preparation with direct oversight, and the affected slaves slowly recovered. But the incident had achieved something significant. It created unease among the enslaved workforce. If their food could be poisoned, if danger could come from communal pots they all shared, then no one was safe. The cohesion and routine that allowed a large plantation to function began to fray at the edges. On August 25th, Vaughan's prize breeding bull, a valuable animal worth over $500, was found dead in its pen. The bull, a massive creature imported from South Carolina specifically for breeding purposes, had shown no signs of illness the previous day. The livestock handler, a slave named Jacob who had tended the animal since its arrival, found it dead at dawn when he came to provide morning feed. Reynolds, called to examine the carcass, could identify no obvious cause of death. No visible wounds, no signs of poisoning, no evidence of disease. The animal simply stopped living. Reynolds' best guess was heart failure, though bulls of that age rarely died of cardiac issues. The meat was deemed unsafe for consumption, and the carcass was buried. The loss was financial. $500 represented a significant investment, but also symbolic. A breeding bull was a sign of a plantation's ambition and sophistication. Its mysterious death suggested vulnerability in even the most controlled aspects of plantation operations. On September 1st, Sullivan discovered that someone had been tampering with the plantation's water barrels. The main house and overseer's cottage drew water from a well, but field slaves received water from large barrels, filled daily from the well, and transported to the work areas. Sullivan, conducting a routine inspection, noticed an unusual smell from one of the barrels, faintly bitter, almost medicinal. He immediately prohibited slaves from drinking from that barrel and sent a sample to Reynolds for analysis. The doctor identified traces of a substance he couldn't definitively name, but believed might be derived from certain plants native to the coastal region. Not enough to cause serious harm in the diluted concentration found in the barrel, but enough to make anyone who drank from it feel nauseated and weak. The incident suggested deliberate sabotage, but no evidence pointed to any specific person. The barrels were filled at dawn by a rotating crew of slaves. Dozens of people had access to them throughout the day. Celeste had been near the barrels, but so had 40 other field workers. Isaac reported that she had never been observed adding anything to the water or behaving suspiciously around the barrels. Vaughn, reviewing these 3 incidents collectively with Sullivan over dinner on September 4th, recognized the pattern forming. "It's death by 1,000 cuts," he said, pushing his plate away, his appetite gone. Nothing catastrophic enough to warrant outside intervention or investigation, but each incident erodes trust, creates paranoia, diverts attention from regular operations. The slaves become suspicious of their food and water. I become suspicious of the slaves. Everyone becomes suspicious of everyone. "Do you think it's her?" Sullivan asked bluntly. Vaughn hesitated before answering. "I think she creates an environment where these things become possible, or perhaps more accurately, where they become inevitable. A plantation runs on routine, on trust, or at least on reliable fear and coercion. Once that erodes, once people start questioning what they eat and drink, once they start seeing threats in every shadow, the system becomes unstable. And unstable systems find ways to collapse. So what do we do?" Vaughn made a decision that several previous owners had likely considered but never executed. He confronted Celeste directly. The confrontation occurred in Sullivan's office on the morning of September 5th, 1852. The office, located in a building separate from both the main house and the slave quarters, provided privacy for difficult conversations. Vaughn, Sullivan, and Isaac were present, along with Celeste, who had been summoned from the fields. She stood before the 3 men, her dress dusty from fieldwork, her hands folded, her expression as neutral as always. Vaughn had prepared for this conversation, had rehearsed various approaches, had considered what questions might penetrate that blank exterior. Now, facing her directly, he found his carefully planned interrogation approach seemed inadequate. He began formally, as if conducting a legal proceeding. "You are aware of the incidents that have occurred over the past 3 weeks? The poisonings, the dead bull, the contaminated water?" Celeste's voice, when she finally spoke, carried that soft, measured quality that all her previous owners had noted. "Yes, sir." "Do you have any knowledge of how these incidents occurred?" "No, sir." "Have you observed anyone tampering with food, water, or livestock?" "No, sir." Vaughn felt his patience thin. The formal approach was producing nothing. He changed tactics, his voice hardening. "I have reviewed your sale history. 12 previous owners in 5 years. Every single one of them suffered catastrophic misfortune. You expect me to believe you know nothing about these patterns?" For the first time, something flickered in Celeste's eyes. Not fear or defiance, but something closer to acknowledgement. "I expect nothing, sir. I go where I'm sold. I do what I'm told. What happens to the men who buy me is not my doing." Sullivan, standing to Vaughn's right, interjected. "Then explain why disasters follow you. Explain why 12 estates have collapsed." Celeste turned her gaze to Sullivan. When she spoke, her voice remained soft, but the content carried an edge that none of the men had heard before. "I don't need to do anything. You do it to yourselves." The room went silent. Vaughn leaned forward in his chair. "Explain that statement." Celeste's eyes moved to some point beyond the men's shoulders, that characteristic habit of looking through rather than at her interrogators. "Every man who bought me saw something he wanted. Not a worker, not a servant, something else. And that wanting made them blind. They stopped watching their overseers. They stopped checking their books. They stopped maintaining the discipline and oversight that kept their operations profitable. They made enemies of their neighbors with their obvious intentions. They weakened themselves, and their enemies smelled blood. Their overseers stole from them. Their slaves resented them. Their creditors questioned their judgment. I just waited. I always just wait." Sullivan moved to strike her for insubordination, but Vaughn held up a hand, stopping him. Vaughn asked another question, his voice carefully controlled. What about the poisonings here at Blackwater Point? The dead bull, the contaminated water? Are you claiming you had nothing to do with those incidents? Celeste's expression didn't change. Your slaves hate you. Not me specifically, all of you. They hate the system you built. They hate that their children can be sold. They hate working from dawn to dark for your profit. They hate having no future but more of the same. I don't need to poison anyone. Some of them will do it themselves when they see an opportunity. Some of them will sabotage equipment or kill livestock just to strike back at you in the only way available to them. Your overseer steals from you because he knows you'll never trust him fully, so he takes what he can while he can. Your neighbors wait for you to fail so they can buy your land cheap. I don't create these conditions. They already exist. I'm just aware of them. The implications hung in the air. Vaughn felt a chill run through him despite the warm September morning. What Celeste was describing wasn't supernatural or even particularly mysterious. It was systematic analysis of the structural weaknesses inherent in the plantation system itself. She was describing a kind of social engineering, a manipulation not of events, but of the inevitable forces that led to events. Isaac, who had been silent until now, asked a question that surprised both Vaughn and Sullivan. Why? If you're so smart, if you see all this, why haven't you run? Why haven't you poisoned masters directly instead of waiting for everything to fall apart? Celeste turned her attention to Isaac, the first time she had looked directly at any of them. Running gets you caught and killed. Poisoning gets you caught and killed. But watching, waiting, being present while proud men make the mistakes that proud men always make, that keeps me alive. That keeps me moving. Every time an estate collapses, I get sold. Every time I get sold, I start the pattern again. I've outlasted 12 owners in 5 years. How many field hands can say that? How many survive even 5 years of your tender care? The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Vaughn found himself facing an unexpected realization. Celeste wasn't insane, delusional, or supernaturally empowered. She was coldly, brutally rational. She had identified a survival strategy within the slave system and executed it with precision. By being purchased by vulnerable men, by becoming a visible symbol of their weakness and poor judgment, by simply existing as a catalyst, she had ensured her own continued survival while watching her owners destroy themselves. Vaughn ordered Celeste removed and locked in the plantation jail, a small brick building used to punish serious infractions. As Isaac led her away, Vaughn and Sullivan sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Sullivan spoke. "What do we do with her?" Vaughn didn't answer immediately. He was thinking through the implications of what Celeste had revealed. Finally, he said, "We need to conduct a complete audit of plantation operations. Everything. Books, overseers, supplies, slaves, neighbors, creditors. If she's right, if the system contains the seeds of its own collapse, then we need to identify and eliminate every vulnerability before they're exploited." The investigation that followed over the next 2 weeks was the most thorough examination Blackwater Point had ever undergone. Vaughn and Sullivan reviewed every ledger entry from the past 3 years. They interviewed every driver and trusted slave about plantation operations. They inspected every building, every piece of equipment, every supply store. They met with Vaughn's factor in Savannah to review his commercial relationships. They consulted with his attorney about his legal standing. They even invited a neighboring planter, a man named Robert Weston, who had always been friendly, to provide an external assessment of the operation. What they discovered shocked Vaughn, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. Sullivan had been systematically embezzling for at least 18 months. Not large amounts that would trigger immediate detection, but small percentages skimmed from various accounts, supply purchases inflated by 5%, slave clothing budgets padded by 10%, tool acquisitions marked up beyond actual cost. Sullivan had been clever, spreading the theft across multiple budget categories, ensuring no single discrepancy would be obvious. But the cumulative impact amounted to approximately $4,000 of missing funds. When confronted with the evidence, Sullivan initially denied it, then claimed he deserved the extra compensation for his competent management, then finally admitted the theft with something approaching defiance. "You inherited wealth, Alexander. I earned every dollar I have through blood and sweat. Yes, I took some. Yes, I planned to take more. Was I wrong? By the law, certainly. But by natural justice? I managed this plantation for you while you played gentleman farmer. I made you wealthy. I took a percentage for myself. Vaughn felt genuine pain at the betrayal. Sullivan had been more than an employee, had been something approaching a friend. But the law and business necessity left no room for sentiment. Sullivan was dismissed, arrested, and prosecuted. He served 2 years in the state prison before dying of fever in 1854. The investigation revealed other problems. 2 field slaves, brothers named Samuel and James, confessed to contaminating the water barrel. Not on Celeste's orders, not even with her knowledge, but because they had overheard Sullivan and Vaughn discussing selling them south as punishment for low productivity. They had acted out of desperate fear, hoping to cause enough disruption to prevent the sale, or at least draw attention to their situation. The dead bull, as best as Reynolds could determine, had indeed died of natural causes, an undiagnosed heart defect that might have killed the animal at any time. Its timing had been coincidental, though its symbolic impact had been real. The lead poisoning remained partially mysterious. The most likely explanation, according to Reynolds, was accidental contamination from an old paint storage area near the kitchen, from which white lead powder might have been carried by wind or inadvertently transferred by someone who had been in that area. Martha, the cook, recalled that repairs had been done to the kitchen roof in mid-August, and workers had stored equipment near the old paint supplies. The contamination, while dangerous, was likely unintentional. But the most damning revelation came not from the internal investigation, but from Vaughn's inquiries in Savannah. His factor, meeting with him privately, revealed something Vaughn had not known. The speculation about his purchase of Celeste, the rumors of his intentions, had damaged his reputation in the commercial community. Factor firms that had previously been eager to handle his cotton were now cautious. A bank that had been considering extending him credit for expansion had withdrawn the offer. Business associates who had previously sought his partnership on various ventures had quietly distanced themselves. "You're seen as reckless, Alexander," his factor explained, his discomfort obvious. "Buying that woman. After what happened to the others, it marked you as either arrogant or foolish. Successful men in our community don't need to prove themselves by courting obvious danger. They exercise prudent judgment. By acquiring her, you suggested you lacked that prudence." Vaughn pressed for specifics. Who exactly had changed their assessment of him? Which banks, which factors, which business associates? The list was longer than he had imagined. The damage to his reputation was real, measurable, and potentially lasting. He had not been poisoned or sabotaged directly. He had been compromised by his own arrogance and the assumptions others made based on that arrogance. The mere presence of Celeste, with her notorious history, had marked him as someone whose judgment could not be fully trusted. And in a business environment built on trust and reputation, that marking was potentially as destructive as any physical sabotage. Vaughn spent 3 days considering his options. He could sell Celeste, passing her to a 13th owner and continuing the pattern. He could work her literally to death, a practice that was not uncommon with troublesome slaves. He could attempt to rehabilitate his reputation while keeping her, hoping that successful operations would eventually overcome the stigma of the purchase. Or he could do something no previous owner had considered. On September 18, 1852, Alexander Vaughn went to Savannah and spoke with his factor, his attorney, and his banker. He confessed his error in judgment, not in buying Celeste per se, but in failing to anticipate the reputational consequences. He dismissed Sullivan and brought in a new overseer whose reputation for honesty was unimpeachable. He sold several marginal properties to cover the losses from Sullivan's embezzlement and to demonstrate financial strength to his creditors. He restructured his operations, implementing new oversight protocols and inviting regular external audits to demonstrate transparency. Then he did something that shocked everyone. He gave Celeste her freedom papers. Not out of mercy, not out of guilt, not out of any humanitarian impulse he would have been ashamed to admit in that time and place, but out of cold calculation. A free woman could not be sold. A free woman could not be passed from estate to estate. Whatever power she held, whether real or imagined, whether active or merely catalytic, would be broken by removing her from the system of property and forced labor that had enabled her survival strategy. More importantly, by freeing her, Vaughn demonstrated something to the commercial community: that he could admit a mistake, correct it decisively, and act in ways that prioritized business reputation over ego or precedent. The gesture said, without explicitly stating, "I understand I made an error. I am correcting it in the most dramatic way possible. I am a man who values practical success over pride." The manumission papers were executed on October 1st, 1852, in the Chatham County Courthouse. Celeste, aged 27, became a free woman of color with legal documentation of her status, a rare occurrence in Georgia's coastal counties where free blacks were viewed with suspicion and their numbers were deliberately kept small. Vaughn's attorney, a man named Benjamin Porter, who had handled dozens of estate liquidations, including several of Celeste's previous sales, conducted the legal proceedings with professional efficiency. But afterward, in his office, he asked Vaughn a question. "Do you believe she was actually responsible, or was it all coincidence and social dynamics as she claimed?" Vaughn considered his answer carefully. "I think she recognized a pattern in the slave system that most people don't see because it's too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Plantations run on forced labor maintained by violence. That violence creates resentment. That resentment creates opportunities for sabotage. Most plantations survive because owners maintain constant vigilance and overwhelming force. But if an owner becomes distracted, if he shows weakness, if his judgment is questioned by the community, then the resentment finds its outlet. Slaves sabotage operations, overseers steal, neighbors exploit vulnerability. Creditors demand payment. It all cascades. Celeste didn't create any of that. She just made herself visible to men who were already vulnerable, whose purchase of a beautiful slave for obvious reasons signaled their weakness to everyone watching. And then she waited. Porter nodded slowly. "That's a disturbing analysis. You're suggesting the whole system is inherently unstable, held together only by constant vigilance and violence. Isn't it? When have you ever seen a plantation run successfully without both?" The attorney had no answer. Vaughn's final interaction with Celeste occurred in Porter's office after the paperwork was complete. He gave her $50, enough to establish herself in Savannah, or more likely, to purchase passage on a ship north to a free state where her papers would be respected without constant scrutiny. He also provided a letter of introduction to a Methodist minister in Savannah who assisted free blacks. Celeste accepted both without comment. Then, as she turned to leave, she spoke one final time. "You're the only one who understood. The others saw what they wanted to see. You saw what was actually there. And what was actually there? A system eating itself. I was just a witness." She left Porter's office, walked out into the Savannah afternoon, and effectively vanished from historical record. The historical record of Celeste effectively ends on that October afternoon. Manumission records show she collected her papers, signed with an X, and received her $50. But beyond that, she appears nowhere. Savannah city directories from 1853-1860 contain no listing for anyone matching her description. She appears in no census records, no church rolls, no land deeds or business licenses. The Methodist minister Vaughn referred her to, Reverend James Caldwell, noted in his records that she visited his church once in October 1852, but never returned. Several historians have attempted to trace her fate. The most thorough investigation, conducted in 1932 by a graduate student studying free blacks in antebellum Georgia, found only dead ends. Ships' passenger manifests from Savannah in late 1852 included several freed slaves heading north, but none named Celeste. The records of free black communities in Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston contain no matches. She simply disappeared. One possibility, suggested by several researchers, is that she changed her name. Freed slaves often adopted new names to mark their change in status. Without knowing what name she chose, tracing her becomes nearly impossible. Another possibility is that she traveled to a northern state or Canada, where records were less systematic or simply haven't survived. A darker possibility, acknowledged but unverifiable, is that she died shortly after gaining her freedom, from disease, accident, or violence in a period when free blacks faced constant danger. The most intriguing clue comes from an unlikely source. A brief mention in a letter written in 1867 by Marcus Hartford, the brother of Charles Hartford, who had been committed to the asylum. Marcus, writing to a cousin in Philadelphia, mentioned, "I happened to be in Charleston on business and saw a woman I could swear was the one who attended Charles before his breakdown. She was working as a seamstress in a shop near the wharf, appeared to be managing quite well. I did not approach her, what would I say? She gave no sign of recognizing me, and I thought it best to let sleeping dogs lie. If the woman Marcus saw was actually Celeste, then she survived at least 15 years after her freeing, established herself in a trade, and successfully built a life in freedom. But the identification was uncertain. Marcus admitted he had only seen her a few times 15 years earlier, and no corroborating evidence exists. 12 plantations had fallen, 12 men had been destroyed, some by death, others by bankruptcy, madness, or legal prosecution. The total economic damage exceeded $500,000 in 1852 currency, equivalent to perhaps $15 million today. More than 3,000 enslaved people had been displaced by the estate sales and foreclosures, families separated, lives disrupted. Communities had been damaged by the loss of established estates that had provided economic stability and social structure for decades. And what of Alexander Vaughan, the one who broke the pattern? His story provides the epilogue to this dark chapter. Blackwater Point continued operating until 1861. Vaughan, having learned hard lessons from the Celeste affair, implemented systematic reforms. He brought in a new overseer with unimpeachable credentials. He instituted regular external audits. He maintained meticulous records that were reviewed quarterly by an independent accountant. He cultivated relationships with other planters based on mutual transparency rather than competitive secrecy. He rebuilt his reputation through consistent, demonstrable competence. The plantation prospered. Cotton yields increased. Financial stability returned. By 1860, Blackwater Point was considered one of the best-managed operations in Liberty County. Vaughan had not only survived the test that had destroyed 12 others, he had emerged stronger. But the Civil War would render all such successes meaningless. When Georgia seceded in January 1861, Vaughan faced a choice. He could remain and defend the plantation through the coming conflict, or he could sell while the market still functioned and relocate to a safer region. Unlike many planters who believed the war would be short and Southern victory certain, Vaughan's experiences had taught him to assess situations realistically. He saw what was coming. In March 1861, he sold Blackwater Point to a consortium of planters for $180,000, a good price considering the circumstances. He moved to New York City, where he invested his proceeds in banking and railroad speculation. The city's business community, less concerned with Southern social codes than with capital and competence, accepted him based on his track record and financial resources. Vaughan married in 1863 to the daughter of a New York merchant family. They had 4 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, a rarity in that era. He diversified his investments, served on the boards of 2 banks and a railroad company, and became modestly prominent in New York business circles. His Georgia past was known but not emphasized. The war had created many displaced Southerners seeking to rebuild in northern cities, and Vaughan was neither the most nor the least successful among them. He lived to age 76, dying peacefully in his Manhattan townhouse in 1896. His obituary in the New York Times ran to 3 paragraphs, noting his business achievements and charitable donations, but making no mention of Georgia, of plantation life, or of Celeste. The respectful brevity suggested a man who had lived a successful but not particularly remarkable life. But his private papers, donated to Columbia University by his granddaughter in 1923, revealed that Vaughan had never forgotten the lessons of 1852. Among his documents, filed carefully in a folder marked Business Philosophy, was a letter dated November 1852, written to a friend in Charleston who had inquired about the Celeste affair. The letter reads, in part, "You asked me why I freed her when I could have sold her south and been rid of the problem with profit besides. The answer is more complex than you might imagine, and I've spent considerable time contemplating it. First, practically, Her presence had marked me as a man of poor judgment in the eyes of my commercial partners. That marking was worth more than her sale value. By freeing her dramatically, I demonstrated willingness to admit error and correct it decisively, traits valued in business. But second, and more importantly, she was never the poison. She was the mirror. Every man who bought her saw what he wanted to see, a beautiful slave to possess, to control, to use as compensation for whatever was lacking in his life. And that desire, that naked want, revealed them to their communities, to their families, to themselves. It made them vulnerable. It made them targets. Men who are visibly vulnerable in our system do not survive long. Their slaves recognize weakness and exploit it through sabotage. Their overseers recognize distraction and steal. Their neighbors recognize opportunity and maneuver to acquire their property cheaply. Their creditors recognize instability and demand immediate payment. It all cascades, and cascades quickly. Celeste didn't create any of that. She just had the patience to wait for the inevitable collapse, and the intelligence to position herself in situations where collapse was likely. I freed her because keeping her would mean I had learned nothing. She taught me that our entire economic system, plantations, slavery, the whole edifice, runs on a knife's edge. It functions only when owners maintain absolute control, perfect vigilance, ruthless efficiency. Any weakness, any distraction, any visible human failing, and the system turns on itself. This is not a sustainable model. I don't say this from any moral position. I leave that to the abolitionists and preachers. I say it as a businessman assessing a system's long-term viability. What we've built in the South is impressive in scale, but inherently fragile. It requires constant violent enforcement. It creates enemies of those it depends on. It punishes human weakness, which all humans possess. I suspect, though I will not live to see it, that the whole system will eventually collapse under its own contradictions. Not because slaves will successfully revolt, they're too outnumbered and outgunned, but because the vigilance required to maintain the system will eventually exhaust those doing the maintaining, or because economic pressures will make slavery unprofitable compared to wage labor, or because external political forces will dismantle it. I've moved my capital north not because I believe in abolition, but because I believe in survival. Let others discover what I learned in 1852, that systems built on force and fear contain the seeds of their own destruction, and that the only rational response is to exit before the collapse. As for Celeste herself, I hope she found peace. I suspect she found nothing of the sort. Freed blacks face enormous challenges, and a woman alone faces worse. But she survived 12 owners through intelligence and patience. Perhaps those traits will serve her in freedom as they did in bondage. I think of her sometimes, wonder where she ended up, whether she ever looks back on those 5 years and what she accomplished. Because make no mistake, she did accomplish something. She survived a system designed to break people like her. She turned her oppression into a weapon. She destroyed 12 estates and outlasted 12 masters without ever raising a hand in violence. That's a kind of victory, though not one she can ever publicly claim. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson. The most effective resistance in an oppressive system isn't dramatic rebellion, but patient exploitation of the system's inherent weaknesses. Celeste understood that. I wish I could have told her I finally understood it too. The letter, written in Vaughan's careful hand on heavy paper, was never sent, never. The friend it was addressed to, a Charleston planter named William Middleton, died of yellow fever in October 1852, before the letter could be posted. Vaughan kept it among his papers for 44 years, until his own death. The coastal counties of Georgia prospered through the 1850s. New families bought the failed plantations, rebuilt the operations and restored productivity. The names changed. Fenwick Hall became Riverside Plantation under new ownership. Liberty Oaks was purchased by a cotton factor from Savannah. Hartwell Manor was subdivided and sold to 3 different buyers. But the land remained productive, the cotton continued growing, and the system continued functioning. Until, as Vaughan predicted, external forces dismantled it. The Civil War destroyed the economic basis of the plantation system. Emancipation freed the enslaved workforce. Reconstruction attempted, imperfectly and temporarily, to rebuild the region on different principles. The 20th century brought new agricultural methods, new labor arrangements, new social structures. The 12 estates touched by Celeste became cautionary tales whispered among planters during the brief period between 1852 and 1861. Not tales of supernatural vengeance or divine judgment, but something more disturbing. The recognition that the system they had built contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. That recognition, uncomfortable and usually suppressed, lingered in the minds of men who depended on that system for their wealth and status. But mostly, they chose not to think about it. Easier to blame bad luck, weak men, unfortunate coincidences. Easier to maintain the fiction that the system was stable, sustainable, divinely ordained. Easier to continue as they always had, vigilant against external threats while remaining blind to the internal contradictions that would eventually bring the whole structure down. Celeste, wherever she ended up, whatever name she took, whatever life she built in freedom, remains a mystery. The historical record tells us she existed, that she passed through 12 estates in 5 years, that she was present for 12 collapses. But who she actually was, what she thought, what she felt, what she intended, remains unknowable. Perhaps that's fitting. In a system that treated people as property, that denied them voice and agency and personhood, the most profound act of resistance might be simply to remain unknowable, to pass through the system leaving no trace but destruction in your wake, to survive by understanding better than your masters the forces that would destroy them, to be present at the collapse of 12 estates and walk away free while they crumbled behind you. That's the story of Celeste, or at least it's the only story the records allow us to tell.